Good afternoon and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Thank you for joining us for our monthly Lunch and Learn program. Now, before we get started, there are notepads on the table for taking notes and writing down any questions that you have. One of our staff members will gather the questions and type them in the chat during the Q&A part of the program. If this is your first time joining us, our 2023 annual theme is Difficult Decisions. All year, we've been exploring tough decisions made during the Eisenhower administration. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Philip Joyce. He will be talking to us about the decision to have a balanced budget. So Dr. Joyce, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Joy, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Just a couple more words about me, just so you sort of understand where I'm coming from. I'm currently a professor of policy at the University of Maryland. I've taught at several other universities, but probably most relevant to this presentation, I spent 5 years in the early 90s working at the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, and in fact, my entire career has been spent either in the practice or study or teaching of public budgeting. So when Joy invited me, I said, well, I'm not an Eisenhower scholar, but we had a conversation and we decided that it might be a useful thing to be talking about sort of some comparisons between the budget in the Eisenhower administration and today, and in particular, what might we sort of think in terms of what President Eisenhower might have done, faced with the budget situation that does face us today. Just one quick sort of acknowledgement before I move on. What made me sort of first think about this when I was approached was Rudy Penner, who was at one time the director of the Congressional Budget Office, actually wrote an article for a journal that I am the editor of, and it was called When Budgeting Was Easier, Eisenhower and the 1960 Budget. So that was quite influential to me in terms of thinking about the comparisons between President Eisenhower's time and the current time. So if we could move maybe to the first slide, actually the next one after that. Thank you. So there really are going to be kind of two broad parts to my presentation. The first is I'm going to talk about how the budget has changed and how the environment for the budget process has changed since 1960, which was around the end of the Eisenhower administration. And then the second sort of broad piece of the presentation will discuss how President Eisenhower might have dealt with the current budget and the budget process. And part of what I'm going to focus on there is, the things that would make it more difficult now than it was in 1960, but also some of the things that we know about the way President Eisenhower behaved with respect to the budget, which might suggest that there were particular qualities that he had and practices that he had that might have actually been helpful in dealing with the budget that we have today. So next slide, please. So in this first part, and I'm just going to run through quickly the topics that I'm going to address that together are about what it is that makes the budget different now than it was in 1960, and then I'll go through each one of these in more detail. The first is that the budget is larger and more complex than it was when President Eisenhower was president. The second is, and this will not surprise anybody, that the federal debt is much larger. And this next one will really not surprise anybody if you've been paying any attention to the recent news. The budget process does not run as smoothly as it did in the Eisenhower administration. The fourth is that partisan gridlock is much more common now. And this is in part because the distance politically between the two parties has gotten much greater. And again, all of this to me raises the question of how President Eisenhower might have managed all this. But before we get to that, I do want to kind of run through each one of these and kind of describe for you what it is that makes the budget different now than it was in 1960. Next slide, please. So there's, some perception, I think, out there that the federal budget is much larger than it was in 1960. And the answer is it's not much larger than it was in 1960, but it is significantly larger. Economists, and I'm not an economist, and I brag about that on some days, and I apologize on others, but economists like to think about the budget as a percentage of the gross domestic product. And what that really means is what's the bite that the budget is taking out of the overall economy. So if you look at the years of the Eisenhower administration, spending averaged about 17.6% of GDP. If you then look at the budget since the Reagan administration, and if you leave out the couple of years when the budget was really very much larger because of response to COVID, and that's fiscal year 2020 and 21, the spending in the budget has averaged about 20.6% of GDP. And that 3% of GDP doesn't seem like it's a big number, but that does represent about a 17% increase in overall spending between the Eisenhower years and the current years. And when we start to sort of take that apart, I think that what is striking is that there have been several changes in the responsibilities of what government does. There have been new cabinet level departments. The Environmental Protection Agency, for example, was created during this time. The Department of Energy was created during this time. The Department of Education, which had programs that were in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, but the Department of Education was made a cabinet department in 1977 by President Carter. And then I didn't even mention here the Department of Homeland Security, which didn't really involve a big increase in the budget, but it did take a lot of programs that were in different agencies. For example, the Transportation Security Administration and the Coast Guard were in the Transportation Department, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency was its own agency and put those together into a single Homeland Security agency. And then perhaps most significantly, we have the creation of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. So these are programs that did not exist in the Eisenhower administration. And partly because of all of this, and also because, as we'll see, of the growth in other entitlement programs, there's been a dramatic change in the composition of the budget. The portion of the budget that is actually controlled on an annual basis, meaning it is subject to annual appropriations, is called, in federal budget speak, discretionary spending. And what that really means is it's spending that is annually appropriated. And just parenthetically, when we are discussing the possibility, of a government shutdown, it is only that portion of the budget that is affected. The rest of the budget is more or less on automatic pilot. And what that means is that there are laws that govern Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and as long as people continue to be eligible for those programs, the Congress and the President don't have to take annual action in order to keep that funding going. Now, the reason this is significant in terms of thinking about the differences in the budget between the Eisenhower administration and presently is because it, in fact, was the case that in 1962, and I chose 1962 because it was the last year the Office of Management, or the first year the Office of Management and Budget sort of presented this kind of information. Annually appropriated spending was about 2/3 of the budget. But in 2022, it was only 26%. And in 1962, defense was about 50% of the whole budget, and in 2022 it was 12%. So what you see now is you see a graph which sort of shows you that, graphically. And what I want you to focus on, because I've learned over time that some people are word and number people and some people are picture people. So for the picture people, of which I am one, I want you just to focus on the gray and the blue areas of this pie chart, or these pie charts. And by the way, these are my obligatory pie charts. You can't talk about a budget without talking about pie charts. And so you see the gray part, which is defense spending, is 49% of overall spending in 1962 and only 12% in 2022. Conversely, you have mandatory spending, which again, the biggest parts of mandatory spending are Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, which was 26% of the budget in 1962 and now is 2/3 of the budget, 66% of the budget. And the other portions, just so we can complete the picture here, are what's called non-defense discretionary spending, and that's basically all appropriated spending that is not the Defense Department, which has declined slightly as a percentage of the budget, but not nearly in the same way that defense has. And then interest on the debt, which is this yellow part, which is the money that we borrow in order to finance, the interest that we pay on the money that we borrow in order to finance our deficits. And just parenthetically, there have been federal budget deficits in 46 of the last 50 fiscal years. So this is a normal occurrence for there to be budget deficits. Next slide, please. So why has this major shift in the budget occurred? Well, just to put a little bit more detail on this, this major growth in entitlement spending, which resulted in this big increase from 26% of the budget to 2/3 of the budget, involved the expansion and creation of the following programs. First, Social Security, which of course already existed in 1960, but it was only 8% of the budget in 1960, and by 2022, it was 19% of the budget. Medicare and Medicaid did not exist in 1960. They were created in 1965, but by 2022, they were 21% of the budget. So you can see just between those three programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, we're talking about 40% of the budget, up from 8% of the budget at the end of the Eisenhower administration. And then we have various other entitlement programs, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is what most people think of as food stamps, Transitional Assistance for Needy Families, which is the old AFDC program, which is a public welfare program essentially, and then the Affordable Care Act, which has created, for example, sort of subsidies for lower income people, and then the Children's Health Insurance Program. I mean, those are just some examples of some significant programs in addition to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So you can see there are a lot of programs out there in this mandatory entitlement portion of the budget. And just to make the point again, these entitlements that are now 2/3 of the budget are on more or less automatic pilot. In fact, some people, and I don't really like this term, but some people refer to this as uncontrollable spending. And it's not really uncontrollable. What it really means is not controlled through the annual appropriations process. The Congress and the President could decide to control entitlement spending anytime they wanted to. But what they would have to do is they would have to make changes to those programs through law that would, for example, either change the number of people who were eligible for these programs or change the amount of money that they got. You could, for example, decide to raise the age at which someone would receive Social Security, or you could decide to cut the level of benefits or slow the growth of inflation or something like that for those programs. But that would take a change in law, and the Congress has not been anxious to do that. Congress or presidents have not been anxious to do that because many of these programs, and especially Medicare and Social Security, are very popular programs, and therefore they're politically difficult to change. Nobody, to my knowledge, ever got elected to Congress on a pledge that they were going to cut Medicare and Social Security. So these are not only large programs and growing programs, but they're also programs that politically are difficult to change. Next slide, please. So when you put all of this together, I just wanted to sort of show you graphically what the trend is in terms of the federal debt. And this particular chart starts in 1940. I actually have one that goes back to 1789, but I spared you that. But one of the things I want you to focus on here is I want you to focus on this spike that occurred in the late 1940s. And that spike, of course, is called World War II. And so we ran up a significant amount of debt during World War II. But then you also see what happened on the other side of World War II. And this is quite relevant for us because this is the Eisenhower administration, which is that the debt came down substantially. How did the debt come down? And again, this is as a percentage of gross domestic product. It came down because we actually ran budget surpluses in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration, especially during the early 50s. There were some small deficits in the later part of the 50s. If we had gone back to 1789, then you would have seen the same pattern after the Civil War, and you would have seen the same pattern after the First World War. So then if we go sort of further down this chart, you can see that the debt kind of stabilized itself during the 1960s and really until about the early 1980s at about 25 or 30% of GDP. And then we had an increase in the debt that occurred during the Reagan administration, which was really a combination of the Reagan tax cuts and the increase in the military budget that occurred after President Reagan was elected. And then, so the debt sort of rose, until you got to about the mid to late 90s, and then it began to come down. And the reason it came down in the late 90s is because we had 4 years of budget surpluses starting in fiscal year 1998. And then it sort of stabilized at around 40% of GDP. And then you see this big spike that begins to occur in about 2010 or 2011. That's the Great Recession. And what recessions do is they drive down revenues and they drive up spending. And they do this almost by design because people aren't earning as much money, therefore they're not paying as much income tax. And we have a lot of programs like unemployment insurance and Medicaid, which are designed to put more money into the economy and into people's pockets when the economy is in recession. So just about the time we begin to recover from the Great Recession, COVID happens. And you can see this big immediate spike that happens around 2020 and 2021. The last thing I want you to focus on here is the other side of this vertical line where it says projected. These are, by the way, I should have said, this is a chart that comes from the Congressional Budget Office. And what the Congressional Budget Office does is it projects what would happen to federal spending and revenues if the budget was just left on automatic pilot. And what that essentially means is that appropriated spending grows with inflation. Entitlement spending doesn't become more generous or less generous. It's just allowed to grow however the law says it would grow, with cost of living increases, for example, for Social Security. And it means that we don't actually change the tax law. So we are not raising taxes, we are not cutting taxes over this period. But because entitlement spending is growing so much over this period and we are not raising taxes, a lot of the reason for what you see as this big increase to the right of the vertical line is because we're borrowing money in order to make up the difference. So it's the interest on the debt that is really driving this. And it's kind of like, those of you who have credit cards, if you didn't pay your credit card bill in full every month and you kept just paying the minimum, what would eventually happen is the interest would eat you alive. And this is what's happening sort of going forward, is that the interest is eating the federal government alive. This is not a prediction of what will happen. It's simply a projection of what would happen if we didn't do anything to change this. Next slide, please. So that's about the budget so far. But there are also problems in the budget process. The budget process, as I suggested early on, doesn't run very smoothly. And its major problem is a lack of timeliness, meaning that the fiscal year begins on October the 1st, which is coming up this coming Sunday. And the history has been that we normally do not pass budgets by the beginning of the fiscal year. Now, there are two manifestations of that. The most serious, but the less frequent one, is what's called a government shutdown. And there have been 4 such government shutdowns since 2013. Often these government shutdowns are relatively short, but the one in 2018 lasted for 34 days. And that was the longest shutdown in history. If the Congress and the President don't agree on appropriations between now and October the 1st, that means that we may be facing this again. And they can avoid that in one of 2 ways, either by passing all the regular appropriation bills, which is not likely to occur because they haven't passed any of them so far, or they can pass something called a continuing resolution. And that's simply a short-term appropriation that buys them more time. So, the reason that a shutdown would occur, if it does occur, is because neither one of those things had happened. And in fact, to my second sort of manifestation, it is normal, which doesn't mean good, but it is normal for the Congress to actually not pass appropriation bills before the beginning of the fiscal year. But what usually happens is that they pass one or more continuing resolutions as opposed to having a government shutdown. Now, just sort of parenthetically, I think probably a lot of you already know this, but a government shutdown doesn't mean that nothing happens. What a government shutdown means is that the appropriated part of the government has no authority to spend money, but then what happens is that the administration, whatever administration happens to be in office, can sort of declare which employees have to go to work and continue to do their jobs. And that is normally sort of referred to, although this is not the official term, but it's probably the best one to use, as dividing the workforce between what are called essential and non-essential employees. So essentially the essential employees, which tend to be anybody who does a job, that involves, public safety in some way, would need to continue to work, and the non-essential employees would not work. But in either case, because there's no appropriation, it means those people would not be paid for the work that they are doing. In past shutdowns, everyone has always been paid, sort of retroactively. So, the last thing I would say about that is that this is a bipartisan problem. This is not a Republican or a Democrat problem. Late appropriations certainly happen all the time. Shutdowns tend to happen more for reasons that you can imagine when we have divided government in some way. Either the presidency and the Congress or both houses of the Congress are not controlled by the same party. Next slide, please. And then the other thing that I think is important to think about in terms of the environment is partisan gridlock. There used to be these people called moderates, and for example, there were in the 1950s when President Eisenhower was president, there were a lot of Democrats who were more conservative than some of the Republicans, and by extension, there were a lot of Republicans that were more liberal than some of the Democrats. That is just not true anymore. There's just this stark division between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the real reason for that is that these people, the moderates, have all but disappeared. And a lot of that has to do with sort of congressional redistricting, where there are a lot more districts now that are sort of safe Republican or safe Democratic districts. But, what this means is that the parties increasingly stake out, I would argue, extreme positions that we might argue are out of the step with the majority of Americans. A lot of the research that's been done suggests that the American people, by and large, are more moderate than members of Congress, meaning that they are neither as far to the left as many of the Democrats or as far to the right as many of the Republicans. And the way this relates to the budget is that there's very little room for compromise because we have one party that won't consider tax increases, and we have the other party that resists cuts in entitlements. There's a famous story, at least it's a famous story in budgeting, which I don't know if that means anything, that there was a bank robber named Willie Sutton. And they asked Willie Sutton why he robbed banks. And he said, because that's where the money is. Well, if you're talking about the federal budget, where the money is in this mandatory spending, and where the money is also is on the revenue side of the budget. But if both of those things are off limits, then it's very hard to kind of get to a solution to the problem that we were just identifying. And then the last thing I will say in terms of sort of the environment for the budget, next slide, is that this just sort of graphically shows you, and this is something that political scientists study, and I'm not a political scientist either, but what this really demonstrates is how polarized the Congress is at any one point in time. And so this goes back to 1880, and the red line is the House and the blue line is the Senate. So the way to sort of interpret this is that the closer that these lines are to sort of bottom of the graph, it really means that the two parties are closer together in terms of the way that they are voting. And the further away you get, the more far apart they are. And so this is just sort of demonstrating graphically that what we had is we had a big distance between the parties in the late 1800s, which then by President Eisenhower's administration had gotten the parties had gotten a lot more closer together, but now they have sort of gradually over time gotten to the place where they are as far apart now as they have been in any time in our history, at least since 1880. It's possible, I don't know, that there was a distance like this that you might have been able to see prior to the Civil War. I'm not sure they were keeping these statistics then, but this is just a sort of graphic demonstration of how polarized the Congress is. So now just moving on to the second sort of broad part of my presentation, which is what this all has to do with President Eisenhower. There are really 4 points that I want to make here. The first is that the budget was a lot more controllable under President Eisenhower. The second is that the norm of a balanced budget was still in place, and that President Eisenhower believed strongly in the idea of a balanced budget. The third is that the president was much more powerful, and the presidency was much more powerful, and President Eisenhower was actually also a lot more popular than some recent presidents have been. And then the fourth, and maybe even the most important one, is that President Eisenhower actually defended his budget strongly, and he tended to defend it rather successfully. So just to go through those one by one, the first one, which is basically how controllable the budget is. Next slide, please. The first one really goes back to a point that I made earlier when I was going through the sort of changes in the budget, that the implications of the increased percentage of the budget that is in entitlement spending is that there's less of the budget that has to be confronted annually. So just the simple fact that the Congress and the president aren't really forced to confront such a large percentage of the budget. They can just ignore it if they want to, and if they ignore it, it just sort of continues on unabated. I think is a significant change, and makes it more difficult. I think it's an open question whether President Eisenhower, who was, as I say, rather forceful in terms of his sort of management of the budget, would have nonetheless really focused on this portion of the budget, even though he didn't have to. But presidents now don't have to focus on this portion of the budget, and if they don't, they just sort of continue. And part of that is because the programs, again, that are fueling the most growth in the budget, which are Social Security and Medicare, are politically popular, and they're therefore dangerous to touch. But also, I think there appears to be a general consensus that defense spending should not be cut. Um, the There is a reluctance to appear to cut the portion of the budget that has to do with sort of supporting the troops and the military. And this is very different than the position that President Eisenhower took. President Eisenhower's budgets actually involved pretty significant cuts in the defense budget, and he had a lot of credibility because, of course, of his own background, because he had come from a military background. And so when he said there was waste in the defense budget, and he said the defense budget could be cut, then that was something that he believed strongly in first, and also that people paid attention to. And then the other sort of piece of this, as I mentioned earlier, is that tax increases by and large are off the table. I mean, there have been some proposals. For example, President Biden, proposed tax increases on the very wealthiest of the people in the country. People, for example, who make more than $400,000 or $500,000 a year. But by and large, sort of tax increases for even the kind of upper middle class have been sort of off the table. And in fact, we have seen some significant tax cuts for those individuals. The tax cuts in 2017 under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they cut everyone's taxes, but they disproportionately cut the taxes of people sort of in the upper income bracket. So our tendency has been, despite the size of the debt and the deficit, our tendency has been not to raise taxes, but to cut taxes, which was a different approach than President Eisenhower took. Secondly, next slide, this sort of notion of an agreed upon set of budgetary norms. As I mentioned earlier, the budget had, out of necessity, become unbalanced during World War II. We had a big increase in the debt. And it was a conscious choice to run surpluses in the early 1950s into really almost the late 1950s that reduced that debt substantially. But part of this was because there was still a general consensus that a balanced budget was a useful thing to try to pursue. And there are arguments out there about whether having an annually balanced budget is a good idea or a bad idea. For example, if we had a requirement for an annually balanced budget during COVID, it would have arguably required that what we would have had to do was to actually raise taxes in order to pay for some of the benefits that needed to be sort of put out there for the people who were out of work during COVID, or for developing vaccines or whatever. But the notion that we should sort of balance the budget over the business cycle, meaning that we can run deficits, but we sort of make up for them by running surpluses, was a relatively strong norm for a long time. And we have no agreed upon rule that has replaced that, right? There's no agreement that we ought to have a balanced budget even over the business cycle. There's no agreement that we should not allow debt to rise to more than a certain percentage of GDP. So I think that's really very much different now than it was in Eisenhower's time. And that's not just an environmental issue. He actually believed in the norm of a balanced budget. And I think when presidents put goals like this out there, it then tends to put the Congress on the defensive. And they have to explain why they have a sort of different goal than the president. So we don't have presidents leading with those kinds of goals, and we don't have them sort of coming out of the Congress at this point. And what that meant was, because he believed in the balanced budget, he was willing to propose unpopular things. I mean, things that maybe he didn't even really want to do because he thought it was so important to try to reach that goal. It's not that he was excited about the notion of raising taxes. It's that sometimes he felt that taxes needed to be raised in order to achieve this overall goal. And if you don't have agreement on the overall goal, then it becomes difficult to do that. Next, there's the issue of presidential power and popularity. The presidency itself was much more powerful in the 1950s and 60s than it is today. There was a law passed in 1974 called the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, which parenthetically was actually passed because of a concern that President Nixon was exercising a lot more power than the Congress was sort of comfortable with. And specifically, what President Nixon did was sometimes the Congress would pass appropriations and President Nixon would sign them. And then President Nixon would decide, well, he didn't like that program, so he didn't want to spend money on it. And that was called impoundment. And it turned out it made the Congress mad. It turned out it was also unconstitutional because the Supreme Court said if Congress passes a law and the president signs it, then the president has to carry it out. But the reaction to that was to pass this law in 1974 that really put more budgetary power in the hands of the Congress than it had been prior to that point. And so what that really means is that the president is sort of less powerful in trying to kind of set the overall budgetary agenda because there's this a bit of more of a tug of war between the Congress and the president in terms of sort of overall budgetary priorities. But in addition to that, President Eisenhower was actually quite popular. The high point of his popularity, he had a 78% approval rating. Now, that's not the highest we've seen. In fact, President George W. Bush, after 9/11, had an approval rating of 92%. But President Bush also, later in his presidency, had an approval rating of 18%. So you can see that kind of wide swing. President Eisenhower, his high was 78%, but it was never lower than 48%. And that's actually, if you will, the sort of highest low approval rating of any president in this century, except for President Kennedy. And so I think the fact that he generally had the support of a lot of the public made him, and the fact that the presidency was more powerful as an institution, I think made him more able to kind of defend his budgets and sort of get his way. And then that's my last point, is that President Eisenhower used his power in order to defend his budgets. He didn't just submit his budgets and then walk away and sort of watch, what the Congress was going to do with them. Instead, he defended his budget, and he did this in informal ways, but he also did this formally. Informally, he had perhaps more press conferences than any president in this century, and he often used those opportunities in the press conference to defend his budget policy. So if he saw that the Congress was doing something that he didn't like relative to his budget proposals, he would say, look, I don't like this. This is not consistent with what I want to do, and try to put that kind of political pressure on the Congress to try to get them to, do the things that he wanted. But there's also, I think this is quite significant, his sort of formal use of his power to defend his budgets. President Eisenhower used his veto power 181 times during the 8 years of his presidency. That's more than 22 times on average per year. If you compare that to the last 35 years, and that's 6 presidents, the veto in the last 35 years has only been used 121 times, or less than 4 times per year. So President Eisenhower was not afraid, if the Congress did something that he didn't want done, to actually use his formal powers, his veto powers, in order to try to get that to change. So you've been very patient. One more slide, which is just kind of bringing this all to conclusion. And so, what do I want you to take out of this? I think first that it's much more difficult, I think, for presidents to manage the budget now than in President Eisenhower's time. But having said that, I think it seems likely that President Eisenhower both could have and would have been more assertive in pursuing fiscal responsibility than many of his successors had been. I think in part because he believed in the norm of a balanced budget. I think in part because he was politically popular. And I think, in part, because, there were just ways that he was willing to sort of assert his power that, that has been less true going forward. I think it is true. I think we have to acknowledge that increased polarization and partisanship would have made that difficult. But President Eisenhower had actually relatively good standing with both parties, and that might have, and of course we don't have a crystal ball, so we don't know, have led to more increased bipartisanship than perhaps we see today. So thank you very much for your patience in listening to all of this, and I hope some people have some questions either about anything I've talked about or anything else you think I might be able to answer for you.
All right, thank you so much. So if you are watching us virtually, please post a comment or question in the chat. If you are downstairs, again, you can just write your questions on the pad downstairs, and one of our staff members will get it and type it into the chat as well. But to kick it off, I hope you didn't answer this. I was trying to follow, so I may have missed it. But when was the change from kind of this idea of keeping a surplus to this idea of deficit spending?
Well, I mean, I would say the change really initially happened during the New Deal. I mean, this was part of the real difference, between, for example, President Hoover and President Franklin Roosevelt, is that when President Roosevelt became president during the New Deal, he said, we have a lot of economic problems here, and we are not going to let the fact that we need, that we feel that we need to have a balanced budget get in the way of our, creating some of these programs that fight some of the big problems that we had during the New Deal. And then, of course, that just kind of ballooned during World War II. So, so the graph that I showed actually started in 1940, but if we had started earlier, we would have seen that this sort of increase in debt was actually beginning in the 1930s, and it was beginning because of the Great Depression and our sort of response to the Great Depression. So I think you would probably, I think it's probably reasonable to say that, there was a general norm, of a sort of balanced budget, except during wartime, up until the 1930s, and then it was really after that point. But again, individual presidents can also, sort of go back to some of those norms, and President Eisenhower certainly did. I should say that the last time that the federal government had no debt at all was 1835. So it's not that there was a time prior to the New Deal that we didn't have a debt. It was more that this sort of norm that the budget should generally be balanced, except when we're at war, or we have other, sort of, fiscal or, economic calamities was much stronger before the New Deal.
All right. So thank you for that. Did President Eisenhower's somewhat moderate ideals, kind of moderate stance, did that really help him with getting that balanced budget pushed through? I know you talked a little bit about people were more moderate then.
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think that he was much, as a moderate, I think he was much closer to some people in both political parties than I think we see today. And I think this is true. Somebody out there who's an Eisenhower scholar can correct me, or maybe you can correct me, Joy. But I thought that there was a point at which, prior to his running for president, that he was sort of approached by both political parties. And so it wasn't even entirely clear to some people in the late 1940s whether President Eisenhower was a Republican or a Democrat. Or whether he was somebody, and he wasn't somebody, of course, he was a career politician. and so I think that the fact that he was himself rather moderate, and then if you add to that the fact that there were more moderates in the Congress than there are today, I think that certainly a combination of those two things probably made it easier for him to kind of put a coalition of people together who would be willing to sort of support his policies than I think you would find today. And I think that is, for better or worse, and I won't make a comment there, but I think you would just, I think he would find as a moderate that he had fewer people, that held those same views, right? Because I think you would find that there were a lot of people in the Congress who were far to his left, and another whole group in the Congress that are far to his right, and these moderates that that I think he would have had a lot of affinity for and with in the 1950s and early 1960s. I mean, a lot of them just aren't there anymore. Of course, the people aren't there, but it's also true that people who have those kinds of views are not there.
All right, we have a question from the room, and it says, it's a comment and a question. It says, when I have debt, then I owe somebody money. Mm-hmm. So explain, who does the U.S. actually owe money?
Well, the short answer to the question is that the U.S. owes money to everybody who buys U.S. Treasury bills. I mean, what happens when the Treasury, and the Treasury actually monitors this quite closely, the Treasury, kind of looks at, how much money is going to be spent and how much money is going to be coming in taxes, and they have to make up the difference, and they have to make up the difference by borrowing. Now, when they borrow, what they're really doing is they're issuing Treasury bills, and whoever it is that wants to make those Treasury bills a part of their portfolio, they do that. And, those people are not loaning the federal government money to be nice. I mean, they're loaning the federal government money because the federal government has promised to pay them back with interest. And what makes Treasury bills attractive is that the U.S. Treasury bills are considered to be, if not the safest, at least among the very safest investments out there. That is, the federal government has never failed to pay back somebody who loaned us money. And that's why, by the way, when if you were kind of following the discussion, I think back in the spring, that was about what became known as sort of whether the federal government would raise the debt ceiling and whether they would sort of default on their debt. One of the reasons that this mattered so much is because if it became perceived that the U.S. government was not going to pay people back or was not going to pay people back on time, then what would happen in that case is that people would begin to perceive U.S. Treasury securities as more risky. And when you perceive an investment as more risky, then what happens is that you have to receive more interest in order to account for that risk that you are taking. So it would have driven up the interest rates that we would have had to, that the U.S. government would have had to pay in order to borrow money. And since there are so many other interest rates in the economy that are sort of pegged to the interest rate for the federal government, it probably also would have driven up interest rates for home loans and car loans and and student loans and everything else sort of out there. Now, the other sort of part of the answer to this question is that we do, and I don't quote me on this because I'm not sure I have it exactly right, but we owe a significant amount of money, and I think it's in the neighborhood of like 30%. To other countries. And what that means is that other countries like Japan and China, for example, are buying our U.S. Treasury bills. And so that's the other piece of this is that, since it's anybody who would decide to buy U.S. Treasury securities, that means that that's bought by individuals. U.S. Treasury securities are bought by, banks and insurance companies, but they're also bought by foreign governments. And I think, I'm sure that Japan and China are the two biggest holders in terms of foreign governments of our debt.
Okay, so I'm trying to work out a question, so bear with me. Working it out loud. But Eisenhower was this formal 5-star general. So he understood like wartime spending and deficit spending, right? And then as a president, he understood. He really wanted to have this balanced budget. But then he also, he gives the speech about
the military-industrial complex.
Thank you, the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to take all of that and bring it forward to today and looking at military spending and things like that. And would he be understanding, looking at the world as it is now, would he, and of course I understand you're making an intelligent guess, but do you think he would be okay with deficit spending at this point now?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so thank you for saying that we don't know. So because we don't know, but I guess I have a couple reactions to that. The one reaction is, I think he would look at what has happened and he would say that what he warned us against in terms of the military-industrial complex has actually come true. I mean, that, if you look at the amount of money that is spent that ends up going to defense contractors, for example, and I'm not suggesting it's wasteful or anything else. I'm just suggesting it's there. And I think, there's, and one of the reasons I believe that members of Congress are inclined to protect the defense budget is because there's so much money in the defense budget that ends up going into their districts, to defense contractors or even just to, if they have military installations in their district. So I think he would look at that and he would say, what I warned you against looks like it has sort of come true. Now, there's another piece of your question, which I think is more difficult to answer. And the one that's more difficult to answer, I think, is if you look at the kinds of threats that there are around the world today, would he look at the defense budget and say, I think we're spending too much money? And I really don't know it's hard to know the answer to that question. I don't think I'm informed enough to know the answer to that question. But I think there are a lot more threats out there, and there are a lot more sophisticated, kinds of threats, including cybersecurity and things like that, than certainly was true when President Eisenhower was president. Now, on the question of whether he'd still believe in the balanced budget, I kind of think he would still believe. I'll put it a little bit different way. I think he would still believe in fiscal responsibility, and I think that whatever you think about the last, at least 25 years since we had the last balanced budget, it doesn't really look like fiscal responsibility. That is, it doesn't look like what people are paying attention to is trying to make, the numbers sort of balance out in the long run. We have seen this sort of steady growth in not only in spending, but also in deficits. I think based on what I know and what I have read about his administration, sort of his attitudes, I think he would find that alarming. And I think he would probably be inclined to try to push in the direction of using the sort of presidential bully pulpit in order to try to convince people that maybe they ought to get together and do something about this problem. I hope that was an answer.
Yes, that was a great answer. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm out of questions, and there are no more questions from the room, and I don't see any questions in the chat. So then I will say thank you so much to you, Dr. Joyce, and thank you so much to everyone who has joined us. We certainly appreciate it. We just have a few closing announcements. So our 2023 public programs are made possible by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Cook Memorial Foundation. So always a big thank you to those two organizations, because without them, we would not be able to provide the programs that we do. And then for our next programs, we'll ask you to join our email list, and we'll send out information that will tell you what our next programs are all about.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed being here, and best to everybody.
Thank you so much, and thank you all again, and have a great afternoon.